All right, so today is May 12th, 2021. I'm Minju Bae, and I'm here with the APA Voices, a COVID-19 public memory project. I'm located in New Jersey, and I'm here with Kyoung H. Park. Kyoung, do you mind if we start with an introduction, your name, pronouns, how you identify, sort of, etc.?
Sure, yes. My name is Kyoung Park. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I am a queer Korean American Chilean immigrant living in Brooklyn, stolen lands of the Lenape people.
Thank you for that introduction. Okay, so as a first question, I was wondering if we could start by my asking sort of an open-ended one, which is, what is it that I should know to get to know you better?
Such an open, such a great question. Well, I carry many different identities. I was born and raised in Chile. My parents are second generation North Korean diaspora. I was born and raised in Latin America, but I live and have lived most of my life as an immigrant in New York City. And even though my life is about, and my work as an artist is all about those intersectionalities, the identity I mostly firmly grasp to is the one of being a theater maker, just because it's the one that I got to choose in my adult life as to who I wanted to be. Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about how these multiple migration stories sort of connect to your work in theater?
Yeah. So I write plays, and most of them are of a political nature. And my early work had a lot to do with identity and the way I could explore and examine my own identity through language, just because I grew up in three of them. As an immigrant in Chile, my parents all spoke Korean, my school was in English, the world I lived in was Spanish speaking. So language has always been an interest of mine. But these days, I write, direct, and produce my work through a peacemaking theater company where we do a lot of anti-oppression work to address structures of violence and war. And I think it has taken me a while to learn and understand how in my writing so much intergenerational trauma was being manifest by exploring the history of our North Korean displacement as a family, the ways we've inherited and embodied war as trauma in our bodies, exploring through physical movement and dance what that means. Also, my own immigrant experience and my upbringing in a dictatorship instilled by the CIA in 1973 in Chile, and just what neoliberalism has to do with all of that. So I feel like my work makes space for those kind of awareness and how those are embodied and what kind of stories come out of those experiences as well. Yeah.
As you were speaking, I was thinking about the so many connections that we can make as it relates to kind of trauma healing and anti-oppression work, and how that kind of has worked through the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I'll ask you some questions about the pandemic and your experience through it. And I know it feels like a million years ago, but maybe we can start with kind of like the early days. How did you hear about it? Like sort of
Mm-hmm.
what was your experience of the first few months maybe
Yeah,
of the pandemic?
for sure. So I think I first became aware of the pandemic through my brother because um, his mother-in-law is a nurse in Korea. So COVID had hit Korea before I became aware of it here in New York. So he was telling me about the seriousness of it and the gravity and how I should find KN95 masks and if possible also send some to his mother-in-law in Korea because they were so inaccessible at that point. And and then it became a little more serious when it started affecting work. I started hearing through the grapevine just different tools. Other major theaters were providing smaller theaters to prepare for an emergency where we'd have to basically start working virtually. And I'd bring up these kind of conversations at work, and I mean, there was still like a little bit of disbelief about it. Like, oh, I don't think it's going to be that bad or it's going to affect us. People weren't showing up to a show that was running at the theater I was working in. And my boss kept on scheduling new shows, being like, people need to come. We should just add more shows. And I was like, they're not coming because there's a pandemic coming. And then I took it very seriously once people started stepping back from me because they thought I might be a carrier because I was Asian, and experiencing kind of racial profiling at work and realizing, yeah, this is real. It's gonna come here and we must prepare. And then I became like one of those people in the movies, just like panic shopping and preparing for the worst. And um, it was quite surprising to just kind of find myself with that high level of like just fear and alert of what may be coming. Um, and and my husband and I would talk a lot about, why are we so good at this? And it's because we come from families that experience so much political oppression. I think we're just like ready for like the worst, and we're great at surviving. So that kind of took off. And then once the quarantine started, well, I guess it just kind of hit home for everyone.
Mm, mm.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. My dog is making a bunch of noise in the background.
It's okay,
Um,
mine too. My
I guess I'm thinking about kind of this moment. I know that when theater shut down, it shut down quite abruptly.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm hearing kind of your earlier experience and sort of lamenting like what it means to be Asian in theater and then sort of working and in the pandemic
Mhm.
and things like this. What was those like kind of early days when theater shut down, and then what was the response? Like, did the city do anything? Like, I don't know.
Mm.
There's so many things about that moment.
Yeah. So I remember the theater shutdown date. It was March 17th, and that was my last day in the office. And also, I served for a few months on a board of a fund called the Indie Theater Fund. And I joined them because they were one of the few organizations that supported small theater arts organizations like mine, kind of too small to receive institutional funding. So pretty much working in the peripheries and off Broadway. And the executive director of the fund said, when this happens, this is going to be really devastating for a lot of people that work in the gig economy, because everyone's going to lose their work. And I mean, that happened in the entire field, but for about 2.5 months, I quit my job and dedicated myself in doing mutual aid work through the Indie Theater Fund. We're the first to respond to the crisis by opening like a micro grant relief assistance uh, grant portal for $500 for people that needed to pay for basic needs following the shutdown. And because we were administering the grants and I was reading all the applications, I got to read hundreds of like just nightmare stories of what people were going through, not being able to pay rent, groceries, losing not just their theater jobs, but their day jobs, waiting tables or working in the service industry. So we were aggressively raising funds to do mutual aid work for this specific community of freelance theater artists. And and then we started having like a real honest conversation about just equity, and the fact that most people of color did not have immediate access to respond to this opportunity to receive support that we knew was needed. And along with the money, I organized two conversations to address community care strategies in the community. And we worked with Kara Page, who is this incredible activist and organizer and healing justice architect who really brought to us a lot of tools to talk about how it was that we could identify how we could support one another based on our relationships to community, and to really work from a place of who we know and who we can help or who we can ask for help. So that was really helpful in the beginning. And then we had a follow-up session where obviously COVID began impacting communities and their health. So there were a lot of more concerns just about the disproportionate impact this was making in Asian communities and Black communities and brown communities, and how there were kind of an emerging number of like grief circles being held in community to process loss. And we talked a lot about grief. And it wasn't just for, you know, the loss of lives, but also the loss of everything that had been happening till that moment. Things shut down. So we had a second gathering with Kara, and an organizer from the Black Lives Matter movement that I know, who's an amazing poet and activist based in Chicago, and to really make space for people of color to really process what was happening to us, because it was very different to the way better funded or more established theaters or better resource communities were experiencing the pandemic. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, I'm so struck by the amount of grieving that we're all facing while the grieving is ongoing. So what you just said sort of really sort of resonates with me. I'm thinking about also what some of the early kind of worries were to you, but maybe also for the industry, or like your subset of your industry. I'm hearing things about kind of economic relief, but then also about sort of this like emotional burden that the pandemic laid. But yeah, I was wondering more if you could speak more on that.
Yeah. So I think one of the hardest realizations that I think we had as artists was, as we were trying to address the needs of essential workers in the healthcare system and in society in general, our position as artists was deemed completely non-essential. And to suddenly see our labor and our vocation as unnecessary at this moment was very troubling, just because we contribute so much to culture and our society in general through the work that we do. And then I think the other worry was just resilience and survival has been something that that artists as freelance workers have been grappling with for years. You know, as a playwright, it's been known for decades now that, you know, we don't make a living really out of the work that we do. So the value of what we contribute as laborers was always something that we had to advocate to be seen and supported. But then when our own persons, you know, were like deemed non-essential, then there was this complete dehumanizing process that happened. And then, you know, as people of color, just the impact on the health of our communities and all of the cracks in the systems, from the education system to the housing system to the food systems, right? Like, were revealed. And then for me, particularly as an Asian person, this was the first time that I experienced fear being in this Asian body in my community. And that was something that was definitely very troubling, and troubling still. I mean, it's almost just gotten worse since the pandemic started.
Yeah, I hear that a lot. The mutual aid work that you were doing, Um, so when theater kind of shut down in the city, were you quarantining? Were you working on the streets? Like, do you have sort of recollection of that period? Was the mutual aid happening in person or, yeah.
Yeah, so a lot of the work that we did was virtual, and we remained virtual, and I was quarantining, um, I think from the shutdown until George Floyd was murdered and there were protests in the city. I think that is when um, we broke quarantine. And until then, we're just trying to figure out how to do everything we could from home. And that included working from home and um, I hate this word pivoting because everyone's been using it, but basically, just figuring out how to translate what live performance can be into the virtual space through Zoom. Um, and also really taking in the way this was affecting our organization and our community. I work with an ensemble. We're about 15 artists that have been together around 10 years. And, many people were displaced and left the city, um, chose or opted or could not afford to be here anymore. So our company was kind of broken and we had to make the most out of what we could from this technology and new ways of collaborating to try to continue working. So it was this real kind of jump into what we could be as artists at this moment. And so much of it has been digitized and become virtual, both by necessity and also by need.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about the virtual performances?
Yeah. So let's see. We started working on a new project called Nero, and it's this Shakespearean epic about the rise and fall of Nero's Roman Empire. And what I did with this play was to tell the story of George W. Bush and the War on Terror, but sort of through the metaphor of the rise and fall of Nero's empire. Um, and uh, the ongoing sort of structural issues that we're trying to address through this play are white supremacy and sort of white male privilege and how it relates to American exceptionalism and imperialism, and and sort of drawing these correlations between this fallen empire and the American empire we're living in today. And it's a complicated story to tell because it's so large in scope. It's 10 actors, it's 5 hours long. It's taken us about 9 months to get through half of the play in rehearsals through Zoom, mostly because we had to learn how to work with it with the technology, but then also, just trying to create art through this moment that is very stressful and traumatic at times. I mean, I kind of feel like maybe 15, 20 years from now, we'll be looking back at the art that was created at this moment, and it's all going to be like Guernica, right? Or like The Scream, just like all of this art that happened in great distress at a global scale. And we'll just not be able to recognize it for what it is until there is some hindsight. So so as you said, like earlier, just like learning how to work with trauma-informed lens and with a healing practice in mind, like we've been just practicing just a lot of care while working. And that has been something that I think we've been trying to like learn about and model in the way we're doing our work right now. Just because, who cares in a way, like I care more about the people than the work. And fortunately, we've been able to really continue working and receive support, which is great because also, like like at this point, like I am kind of Robin Hooding for my company, right? And for the artists that work with me to try to get the support so that I can be of financial assistance, to the artists that work with me as well. Um, and then parallel to that, we started really examining what dismantling white supremacy is to our community. And we've been having a lot of iterative, kind of emergent, sort of community-based meetings since last October. And it's a very high calling and very vague, right? Like, I mean, what do you mean by dismantling white supremacy? And we've gone through a lot of conversations just about internalized whiteness, the history of whiteness, our assimilation to whiteness as people of color, and how to undo that, unlearn that, and to recenter our cultures of origin and personal identities. But when it came to like direct action and collective action, um, last month we had a gathering that I think really helped us cement and make concrete what our focus might be moving forwards, which is really moving forward with an abolitionist lens. Um, and More than the prison industrial complex and dismantling and defunding the police, which I think is important. I think what we can contribute as artists is like the imagination of the world post-abolition. And what is that liberatory space for people of color when these systems have collapsed or are gone? And I think in that space, I find myself very excited about the creativity of the company and what we can contribute to that conversation, and to kind of value and acknowledge that what has been in the periphery and marginalized for so long is exactly the kind of spaces that we need to sort of reinvest in and nurture for the future. Just because, you know, it's like we can bring down as many monuments and white institutions as we want, but you know, like what is going to take their place? And I feel like there is so much out there already that is modeling for us what that future can be. And I find a lot of inspiration in just kind of those kind of questions in our practice. And that's been sort of also like my personal sort of life savior, you know, to just have something imaginative and creative to hold on to in these times.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Can I ask you what abolition means to you?
Yeah. I am aware this work and practice has been happening for very long and that I am very new to it. So I'm gonna probably speak this out in draft because I don't have a concrete sense of what abolition work is. But for my understanding, abolition is God, okay. So abolition is for me the creation of a liberatory world without the prison industrial complex and without the military industrial complex and all of these forms of state violence that have oppressed people of color into genocide, slavery, war, and a centering of a new sense of community that allows us to provide to one another the care and safety that we rely the state to provide for us in ways that it actually doesn't. Um, and I think for me, abolition is also um, an acknowledgement of the ongoing history of slavery in this country that is still perpetuated in all of these modern systems of policing and surveillance and state control and border patrol that are incredibly violent and damaging and dangerous. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'm really admiring this turn to abolition. And I think what you said was that your theater company is doing that. And so as a clarification, is your theater company also the company that's putting on the show, the Nero.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so our company has a peacemaking mission. So our mission is to um, work with artists and local communities and non-artists to transform experiences of oppression into peace messages made public through performance. So a lot of this anti-violence work is interconnected between the work that we're creating artistically and in community, because that's the way we kind of operate as an organization.
Oh, I see. I see. So
Yeah.
these are like sort of intensely aware connections. I guess um, so. Going back to that that production, then I was thinking when you were describing that you were doing the kind of iterative trauma healing and anti-oppression. And I was wondering what that methodology looks like as you're producing this play. Are you holding workshops? Are you getting trained in this form? Or is it more kind of generative conversations? Like, what's can you give me a sense for how that's played out?
Yeah, it's a mix of it all. Um, at first, there was a lot of education that we were receiving and providing to community. Our work with Kara in the beginning was really revealing post-traumatic stress and the way it impacts us. So we began with that. Um, and then, um, and then, you know, I've been in therapy since I was 17. So just kind of focusing on trauma healing has been a priority of mine for the past 2 years. So I really started intensifying both my own healing work and trying to understand the healing arts. And that became very sort of important to me, especially when we were living without a vaccine and understanding that we were dealing with a disease that had no cure, and therefore healing was something that we needed to provide ourselves without the resources of actual medicine, right? So we worked a lot with trauma informed lens. I'm really a firm believer of just sort of somatic work in general. And we incorporated that. And right now I'm actually working with some healing artists to do a workshop on somatic healing art practices in a couple months. It's been kind of like a slow education for us, but we're sharing as we discover sort of things that work for us. And and yeah, we've been sort of applying that as a practice internally and then sharing out and providing sort of educational opportunities when we have something to share. And then just constant learning. Um, mm, yeah, just constant learning. Yeah.
Um, I don't actually know what this is. Somatic healing arts. Do you mind clarifying what that is for me?
Yeah. So PTSD has been treated for a long time as a psychological disorder, but there are some new research um, uh, sharing how trauma actually lives in the body and how these very traumatic events that affect us in our psyche are then stored as traumatic experiences in ourselves. So somatic work is about addressing where the trauma lives in our bodies rather than in our psyches, and to do movement work, breath work, um, and then other kind of therapeutic practices to try to release the trauma from the way it lives inside us. And it's more body based, and it looks into the nervous system beyond the brain and into different areas of the spinal cord and the polyvagal nerves, and restoring um, and addressing no, and it kind of like helps address how mental health can be an ongoing practice where we identify where the trauma is, and through therapeutic practices, almost like a sinking ship, we're just taking out the water out of it so it doesn't drown until the trauma is gone. Um, so 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 yeah, so that's sort of what somatic somatic work is like. Yeah.
Wow, that's so interesting. I'm seeing so many like, I mean, with the pandemic, I feel that so many communities are thinking about healing,
Mm.
kind of generally. And to me, it sounds like you've been sort of doing this work for a lot longer than just the pandemic. So I was wondering if you could take me on this journey of like, of your kind of encountering this language and then also like practicing, um, what it means to be trauma informed. And then it sounds also like kind of migration and diaspora plays into this for
Mhm.
you. So if you could speak a little bit on that, that'd be great.
Sure. Um, well, it's like my entire life story, but I mean, I can give you the main points. So, um, I definitely experience intergenerational trauma. You know, I think my parents as and my grandparents as survivors of war and poverty really lived with a lot of distress in their bodies, and a lot of it has been unhealed. So I learned that, and I became part of my experience growing up. I pretty much have complex post-traumatic stress disorder from all the violence that I witnessed at home as a child. So childhood trauma is sort of like my first trauma. And then there's all of this political trauma, right? Of growing up in a dictatorship, living through 9/11, and then racialized trauma of living as an immigrant in New York, being deported. Like, I mean, I can pile it on. It's like a lot, you know? So, um, so I think, you know, there were many years where in treatment, like I would try to address symptoms like social anxiety or depression or, you know, suicidal ideation or things like that. And it wasn't until maybe like 5 years ago where I just kind of embraced the fact that I have trauma and I am living with a disability and it has impaired everything, my ability to be financially healthy, to be physically healthy, to have positive social relationships. Like so much of my life was disrupted, you know, because I lived in a state of trauma. And and I thought, you know, like going to therapy once a week would help me manage that, but I could see how so many other aspects of my life were really kind of flailing and not being what I wanted them to be. Um, and then things really hit the fan about 2 years ago when I realized that I was in a business relationship with a malignant narcissist. And I was totally in an abusive relationship that kind of really knocked the wind out of my sails, and I benched myself in a kind of dead end job for like a year because it was pretty bad, and that was the year right before COVID. um, and and what I learned from that was that um, one, I needed to process a lot of pain that was stored in my body, and that required healing that wasn't just psychoanalytical, but this more somatic and also holistic kind of practice. And you know, I'm a believer in spiritual realms, so you know, going into past lives and going into, you know, sort of all kinds of other esoteric forms to try to just find the places where the memories that are unresolved are stored and emerge, you know, in that healing space was really important to me. And a lot of that I used to manage to do through writing um, as a therapeutic practice and as a creative practice. But after a while, it was all just kind of trauma vomit, you know, like it was like, it was bleeding on other people. Um, so so now these days, you know, I'm just trying to be more aware of, you know, what is current and what is just unresolved past pain, and to be able to differentiate those things in my awareness of the now. And then to make space for all of that to happen and still find joy, like joy in the things I really love, like joy in making art and not travel these days, but travel and, like my dogs snoring on my shoulder at the end of the day. And just that being like one of the best pleasures of my life these days, and, um, and I think, yeah, it's been a kind of, it's been a really interesting journey to go through.
Mhm. When we last spoke, it was sort of immediately after the murders in Georgia, and we sort of briefly spoke about how we were sort of taking care of ourselves. And then I'm sort of thinking about what you just said too. Um, can I ask you about how you take care of yourself during the pandemic? And um, yeah, and then I guess my second question is sort of an elaboration on the joy piece. Like, how do you make space for joy right now?
Yeah. Um, so um, I work with a lot of healers, and that is my self-care practice. Um, One of the things of coming from lots of states of abuse is sometimes not just being used to being in a space of like self-neglect, so I still kind of do need help in making time for myself to take care of myself. um, so yeah, so I work with some therapists and a healer, and I do it weekly, which has been like really helpful, and it's a huge investment, but it's allowed me to remain really centered and grounded. So I'm just so thankful for that. Um, and then also, um, you know, joy for me um, comes from really being in a state of flow. So protecting my ability to remain creative um, is really essential for me. Um, I don't always love all of the administrative labor I have to do to run my theater company. And sometimes that work addiction is a coping mechanism, and I think it's super unhealthy. But the ability to create, to connect with artists, to be in a space of imagination, like that really is something that like is essential for my living. um, and I have really cemented a lot of very deep relationships with people at this time in my community, even though most of it has been virtual. And I think, that really stems from all of that community care mapping I did in the beginning of the pandemic last year to just really be like, who is core and who do I really need to connect with? And who do I want to be in relations with at this moment in time? And as we strengthened, that kind of core community, and I found myself, like sort of really deeply embedded, with people that I care about at this time. We've also been able to create containers for communities that we want to connect with and we started to do that again this year, after sort of being a little more dormant and iterative in a more close space for the past 9 months. So reconnecting with others is definitely a healing practice. Establishing social relations of accountability and responsibility and mutual care. And then also things like this, just sharing stories, is super therapeutic. So just holding space to tell my story and for others to tell their stories and for us to tell stories together has also been like super healing. Um, in terms of joy, um, I mean, to be quite frank, like travel, sex, and art making are my joys. So like I try to do what I can to like, reconnect with nature, go outdoors, and to have an art practice and to have a sexual life. Like, I mean, depression can make so many other passions go away because we become like so tunnel visioned. Um, and um, and and yeah, just that for very like just me reasons has been sort of also part of my focus and priorities. Yeah.
I'm hearing a lot of maybe a little bit of frustration and a little like kind of contemplation about the nonprofit industrial complex and a lot of what you say, like when you said that the administrative stuff is stuff that you need to do in order to make room for your creative practice.
Hmm.
And I'm thinking a lot about kind of the arts in New York, and how the nonprofit world relies on kinds of pathways of funding that are not necessarily sustainable. And I know you think a little bit about that. I was wondering if there's like, if this time in the pandemic has sort of changed that kind of outlook on how you might run your nonprofit, or like what you've seen maybe as models.
Mm,
Yeah, I was wondering if you have any kind of things to share in that.
yeah. Um, it's a double-edged sword. Um, I come from a organizing background with GPIMNI, which is a grassroots queer Asian organization. And, you know, at the same time, I was an artist, and I, still work with GPIMNI. But I think that working at a grassroots level outside of the nonprofit industrial complex allows one to be radical and to be flexible and nimble and responsive to the community in ways the nonprofits cannot be. And yet at the same time, the sheer sort of like inequity of resource allocation on whether you are a nonprofit or not was just something that I noticed and I've known for a long time. And a lot of my politics are really progressive because of the communities I work with. So I think, sometimes I feel like our community is like 5 to 10 years ahead of the nonprofit industrial complex. And whenever, we're heard, it's either too late or it's through some like, not always sincere co-optation kind of process. So it's very problematic, but I find myself navigating both spaces and being sort of an intermediary and a bridge builder and sometimes a gatekeeper, depending on like whatever it is that needs to be done for the work. And and I think the thing that, I'm most aware of is like there is an indescribable way, like there's no way to describe the way this has affected theater. I think there's some research that is going to be released soon about how like 70 to 80% of the sector was shut down. So the devastation is just enormous, right? Like when 80% of an industry collapses, like I was thinking a lot about, the kind of organizing that coal miners did when coal mines would shut down, or the way, sort of like laborers would like unite when like a factory was shut down. I mean, it was this field-wide shutdown that left everyone without work, you know, and everyone was without a job. So nothing, right, is gonna ameliorate or help the recovery of that on its own, let alone the nonprofit industrial complex. Um, but in what I've been doing, and some of it I can talk about, some of it I can't. What I've been doing is working with a network of arts organizations of color citywide that have been coming together and gathering to respond to the pandemic of COVID-19 and the pandemic of systemic racism and the economic depression our fields are all experiencing, especially as people of color, and trying to address the needs of our communities and these organizations with arts philanthropists. And I think everyone was kind of caught with their pants down, like no one was prepared for this. And the only sort of parallel I can imagine is the kind of recovery that took place in the city after 9/11, but that was a time finite disaster. And this is an ongoing crisis that 12 months later is still affecting us. Like, there's no real way of knowing what the harm has been, because it's still happening now. And I think because of that, responses has been, I don't want to say erratic, but sometimes reactive, because there's no way to really have hindsight from this moment because we're still living through it. And I think the thing that's really sad is that, I mean, we're not just losing lives, we're losing institutions, we're losing organizations of legacy, we're losing elders and vital artists and voices in our community. So, so there's a lot that that I think, you know, we're all trying to answer to in many different levels of the system. Um, and um, and it's hard work. Um, it's 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 been really challenging for me um, to to really come to terms with the leadership positions I've been provided to be of service to my community, um, and and to really get to know myself in that level of like, how much can you do and how much can anyone do at this moment, and how much of the healing that is necessary now is like collective. Like, you know, it's for us to heal through this, we all need each other. The simplest example is, how many of us are gonna not take the vaccine and like get us through this, you know? And then how to address, you know, all the things that we've not been able to witness because we're all still stuck at home. So yeah, many layers.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, that's such an instructive feeling, I think, how we've all sort of collectively experienced something and how we all sort of need to collectively heal from it, I think is such a powerful message. Um, and then all that being said, I also know that theaters are reopening. So what does that mean? Because it sounds a lot like I really liked the way that you put it earlier about how art during the pandemic will sort of be like Guernica. Like I sort of wonder, like now that I wouldn't say we're reopened, but now that that theaters are reopening, what does that mean? And what does that mean for art? What does that mean for theaters? And then of course, like the scale of theaters are of course different.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you could tell me a little bit about that, that'd be great.
Sure. I think there's, I experienced a little bit of whiplash um, when theaters reopened to what theater used to be before the pandemic. So I feel like when I look at the narratives of what's going to be put on stage, I question this return to normalcy versus the way ongoing cultural work is going to be about doing work like this, advancing the stories that were untold and have yet to be heard of and yet to be centered in our cultural discourse and awareness. So I think I'm really happy for the sector to come back because everyone needs to go back to work. But um, there's a lot of conversations, especially among actors, about safe spaces and whether the theater is a safe space to return to. And it isn't just about, you know, health restrictions and COVID regulations, but also just about the systemic cracks that were revealed for people of color and for people that were underserved or misrepresented by their unions at this moment, and what kind of labor protections will exist for people that return to work in the theater. So even though people are wanting to go back to business and people are wanting to go back to work, there are a lot of details about how this is going to happen that remain sort of ever changing and ever evolving um, because every week is still different. Um, so so I'm personally committed to continuing this work virtually through our theater organization. just because not only the artists, but our audiences are people of color. And I feel like for the safety of us all, and to not ask, for $70 for a ticket, but rather a free opportunity to engage in something should you want to. This model of doing virtual work works just fine with me. Um, and returning to the theater for me is a little bit of a question mark. I'm actually a little resistant to it, both for cultural reasons, for safety reasons, and for political reasons. Um, uh, and and I think that's just my stance. I don't speak for anyone else besides myself when I say this, but I am a little skeptical, and I think that um, like, what is that saying? Like, need is the mother of all inventions. Invention is the mother of all need. I can't remember the expression, but um, I think what's happened with theater, the way Napster changed the music industry. Um, Before we were totally dependent on these theaters to be able to do our work, and now we have an immediate, direct relationship with people that want to see our work. Should we want it to be like that? And we don't need these spaces anymore. And they were mostly unwelcoming and exclusionary by design. So the ability to use this technology that has sort of emerged of this moment and continue working in this way is actually a little revolutionary, like in the sense that now we can be both a company and the theater for our community should
Mhm.
we want to. And I find a lot of empowerment in that, um, and a lot of people are like, well, but that's not theater. So, like they'll be like, that's not a live performance. But theater is what you want it to be, Yeah.
Wow, that's so interesting. It really kind of makes you question, like, what is an audience? What is what is theater? Yeah, I'm like really, I can feel my brain cogs moving. I think that that's kind of an amazing set of questions. So okay, so it sounds like virtual playwriting continues on for the time being, especially since we're hearing lots of bad news about the impossibility of herd immunity in this country. Um, I'm wondering what your hopes are for for theater, and then also for what the world might look like. I don't want to say after COVID because I don't think that's what I mean, but I guess like after today, maybe.
Yeah. um, I have a joke response, but then I'll give you them. My joke
Sure.
response. My joke response is, I would love to see the dolphins stay in the East River, and like whatever happens, I just don't want them to go. There's been a kind of restoration work that has happened for the ways global capitalism caused this disease, and its interruption, I think, has allowed us to really take a moment of pause to notice how much destruction and damage we've created in this world. And I think, for a long time, systemic racism and genocide in this country has been sort of in our consciousness, but then also the mass extinction of so much life has been happening as well. So I think this kind of restoration of a more natural balance is something that I've been thinking about quite a lot. And when I think about that, I think a lot about what abolition and the imagination can provide in terms of that imagined future. Um, in our practice through a theater company, we're thinking a lot about what futurism and Afrofuturism and Indian futurism and Asian futurism and all the imaginations of people of color of the future has been. And and I think it's what I look forward to is just like recentering of pluralistic democracy that is in balance with our natural environment, and restitution of justice and democracy in our institutions. Um, and, you know, this dismantling of white supremacy that I think I've been thinking about obsessively for a while, I think also is like an invitation for defection into these spaces that people of color are creating. Because I feel like um, I'm tired of going and thinking about how to fix these institutions that are standing on just such problematic foundation to begin with. And I feel like, you know, this, when I think of like what it is for us to leave our apartments again and to congregate again and to come together again, I just don't want it to be the same way anymore, you know? I want it to be new and different, and I don't want to go back to the same old thing. So I'm sort of being an ally to whatever enables that, you know? Um, yeah.
Mm, wow. Yeah. Oh, those are beautiful hopes, Kyung. I really appreciate that. Um, those are really all of my questions that I have for you today. Um, unless you have some closing thoughts, but I don't know. Thank you so much, Kyung, for sharing with me, and then also for sharing with the APA Voices Project. Yeah, thank
My
you so
pleasure.
much.
Thank you. Thank
I'm
you.
gonna stop the recording.
Okay.